This sounds totally made up until you listen to the police report. In the early 90s, a teenage girl started to see these shadowy figures that would come into her room at night and crawl all around her room and even grab at her legs. At the same time, her health began to rapidly deteriorate, which ultimately led to her death, which doctors never understood. A few days after her death, her sister woke up to a whistling sound and saw a creature crawling around her room with no face. The same night, her mom was ripped out of bed by someone. The father calls the police, who come over, they search the house, they don't find anything, it's all quiet. As they're about to leave, they hear something. Horrifying screams coming out of the bedroom. They run inside, no one's in there, but there are these huge gashes on the wall that were not there before. The police get out of there. In the police report that was filed immediately after this house call, the chief inspector and the 3 officers that were there that night swear they saw and heard the same things as the family, which means the police officially believed that the house was haunted. This is why you should never take walks alone at night. In 2007, a girl was on a late night walk when she looked at the end of the road and saw the silhouette of a man moving around very strangely. It was like he was doing the waltz, but he was moving towards her, so she was sketched out, crossed the road, and went the other way. After a couple minutes, she turned around to see what he was doing, and he was right across the street from her, now staring up into the sky with a huge grin on his face. Now totally creeped out, she turns around and walks about a half block before checking again, and to her horror, he's now crouched down right behind her. But luckily, he stands up, turns around, and kind of hobbles away. And then she notices something. The man had turned around and was now sprinting directly towards her. She runs to safety and now just hopes she never has to see that smiling man again. This is why you should always sleep with your lights on. In 1991, a man named Christopher Case was found dead in his bathtub, fully clothed in the fetal position. When police interviewed his best friend Sammy, she told them about a very disturbing phone call she got from him the night before he died. On the call, he told her that the previous night he had woken up to what sounded like whispering coming from underneath his bed. When he went to look, he couldn't move. As he laid helplessly, he watched a black figure pull itself out from underneath his bed. Once it was fully upright, it reached down and began choking him until he passed out. The next morning when he came to, he felt his neck and it was swollen and bruised. And then he saw blood on his hands and he saw that there were deep, uniform incisions on each of his fingertips. As he's saying all this to Sammy and telling her how scared he is to go to bed that night, he suddenly stops and he says, "I hear whispering outside my room." Then the phone went dead. Remember, your Amazon Alexa is always listening. In 2018, a girl named Alexa came home to her apartment to find her creepy stalker landlord in her kitchen. She screams and threatens to call the cops, and he just smiles and says, "I was just checking in on you," and leaves. Feeling totally sketched out, she spends the next few hours down the hall in her friend's apartment before finally going back to her room to go to bed. That night, she woke up to her Amazon Alexa responding to someone in the room. It said, "I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Did you say I'm watching you?" The girl instantly turns on her lights and looks around, but no one's there. So she unplugs Alexa and is about to go back to sleep when she hears what sounds like a man grunting in her closet. As she's staring at her closet, her Alexa turns back on. This true story is so simple and so creepy. On June 21st, 2009, a 16-year-old wakes up to an empty house around 11 a.m. He heads downstairs, grabs a snack, and goes to the basement and plans on watching TV for the next few hours until he meets his friend around 3. About 30 minutes later, his mom comes downstairs and asks him, "Where have you been all day?" Confused, he says, "I've only been up for like 30 minutes. And then he looks at his phone and it's after 7 o'clock at night. There's dozens of missed calls and several text messages from his friend and his mom asking, "Where are you?" He tells his mom that none of this makes any sense, but what she tells him is even worse. She said that she was there all day and saw him go into the basement at 11, but after that, he was gone all day. So for one day in the summer of 2009, this kid didn't exist. Once you hear why he did this, it will change the way you look at strangers. In 2018, a woman was out for a walk in the blistering cold when she saw a teen girl coming towards her wearing just pajamas and oversized shoes. Turns out it was 13-year-old missing person Jamie Close, and boy did she have a terrifying story to tell. 87 days earlier, a man had broken into her home in the middle of the night, killed her parents, and then taken her prisoner. He brought her 70 miles away to his house where she was kept under a bed and largely forgotten about. She was just there for no apparent reason. When her captor left one night, she managed to escape, and that's when she ran into this woman on the road. Jamie's captor, 21-year-old Jake Patterson, was quickly found, and he immediately confessed. And this is why he did it. On his way to work one day, he stops behind a school bus and he sees a girl get on. He doesn't know anything about her, and he decides, I'm going to kill her family and I'm going to take her. He had no motive, he had no criminal history. This was truly random. This is why you should always keep your head on a swivel. In 2017, an elderly woman who lived alone thought she saw something moving in her backyard and went to the window to have a look. As she's looking around, a shadowy figure emerges right on the other side of the glass, standing in her backyard. Terrified, she keeps an eye on the figure while calling police, but by the time she hangs up, the figure's gone. When the police arrive, her front door is unlocked, so they go inside and they find her still sitting in front of the window looking for this figure. The police search the backyard, but they don't find anything. When the police go back inside to search the house, they quickly find some large footprints that couldn't have been hers in the room that she was sitting in and all around the first floor. That's when they realized what was going on. She wasn't seeing a shadowy figure in her backyard. She was seeing the reflection of someone in the room with her. I can confirm that this is a true story. In 2004, a 16-year-old boy who was staying with a friend in their cabin up in New Hampshire was having a hard time falling asleep. Around 3 a.m., he was still awake, and he remembers thinking how eerily quiet and totally pitch black the house was. And that's when he heard it. The front door opens and someone comes inside and begins walking through the house down the hallway right outside of his door where it stops. The door opens and the boy is instantly petrified because in walks this tall, shadowy figure that marches to the center of the room and then bows onto the ground and disappears. The boy stays up all night, terrified that this thing's gonna re-emerge and just look at him. Finally, he hears his friend's mom making coffee in the kitchen, so he runs out to tell her what happened. The whole time he's explaining what happened, she's just looking at him with sympathy in her eyes. And finally she says, "My husband visited me last night too." Her husband was dead, and I was that 16-year-old boy. If you ever find yourself in this situation, don't do what she did. In 2006, a group of cave divers decided they wanted to film a documentary in one of the most dangerous caves in the world. But only a few hours into their descent, and a freak storm erupts on land, collapsing the entrance to the cave. In order to avoid the huge falling rocks that were coming off the ceiling, they were forced to swim through one of the uncharted sections of the cave. After they've been diving for over an hour, they luckily come across this island in the middle of a tunnel, where they set up camp and wait to be rescued. After 48 hours and no sign of a rescue, the cameraman actually starts filming in case they don't make it out of there. At the same time, one of their crew members does something very stupid. This is why you should always watch videos to the end. In 2003, a woman came home to her apartment to see that her door was unlocked. She went inside, nothing was missing, so she assumed she must have left it open. When it happened a few more times, but still nothing was missing in her apartment, she went out and got a camera, set it up in her apartment aimed at the front door. The next day, her door was unlocked, so she reviewed the footage. She watches in horror as late in the night, her front door opens and in walks this tall, creepy man who looks around and then walks towards her bedroom off camera. She immediately sprints out of her apartment and calls the police, who show up and tell her to go back in her apartment and just try to stay calm, and that they would put an officer right outside her door so she's safe. As she's sitting on the bed, totally traumatized, she realizes something. She only saw him enter her apartment on that video. She doesn't know if he actually left. As she's sitting there, she feels breathing on her ankles. She runs out, the cop comes in, and he finds the tall, creepy man under the bed holding a knife and a camera. This is why you always say yes to tandoori chicken. In 2012, a high school tutor and her student stayed up so late one night studying that by the time they were done, the buses had stopped running. Without another way home, the student asked if he could stay the night at her place. Reluctantly, she agreed. When they got back to the apartment, she fell asleep on her bed and he fell asleep on a blanket next to her bed on the ground. A few hours later, she wakes up to the boy standing awkwardly in the middle of the room with a very strange look on his face. She asks him, "What's wrong?" He looks at her and says, "I'm really hungry. Let's go get some tandoori chicken." Confused, she says, "It's 2 a.m. Just get a snack in the cupboard." And he grabs her by the arm and he says, "No, we are getting tandoori chicken right now." And he yanks her from the bed. Feeling totally caught off guard by this whole situation, she goes into the hall with the boy, and as soon as the door shuts behind them, she can tell that he is terrified. He looks at her and just says, "I'm not actually hungry. When I woke up, there was someone under your bed." Most people believe these 3 things will save your life. They don't. Let's pretend that you're on vacation with some friends in this cabin, and you hear on the news that there's actually a killer on the loose in the woods surrounding your cabin. What do? Instinctively, you're going to want to ditch your friends and just start running into the woods. No shoes, no weapons, no cell phone, no sense of where you're going. But that's actually a terrible idea because the killer is in the woods and you'd be putting yourself more in harm's way, not less. So you decide to stay put, and then you remember that your friend drove you all to the cabin in their brand new Lamborghini that was working like 5 minutes ago. So why can't you just pile into that and drive away to safety? The problem with that is anytime you're in a cabin in the woods and there's a killer on the loose around your cabin, even if it's a brand new car, it's not going to start. So don't even go out and try it. You're just sitting in the cabin doing nothing when all of a sudden you feel like someone could be watching you and you want to turn around and make sure no one is. Don't turn around, because if you do, the killer will magically appear behind you. Boy, did this kid pick a good night to have his phone out filming. In 2008, a teen decided he wanted to film himself playing the very creepy Midnight Game. In a nutshell, you turn off all the lights in your house and you walk around from midnight to 3:33 a.m. And if at any point you stop moving, the Midnight Man will attack you. Around 2 a.m., the kid thinks he hears something in the kitchen, but he also thinks his mind's just playing tricks on him because he is playing this game. But he goes to check it out anyways. When he gets downstairs, he doesn't hear anything, but he does see that his door is now open. And when he goes to shut it, someone pushes back. He sprints away, goes upstairs, jumps into his room, but keeps filming. If you're alone right now, don't watch this video. In the winter of 2018, a man who was living alone in the mountains wakes up to find a red ball sitting on his front yard. He assumed the only neighbor he had must have kids, and so he kicks the ball over the fence, goes inside, doesn't think anything of it. That night, he wakes up to the sound of kids laughing outside of his window. He goes outside to check on them because it's the middle of the night, and there's no kids anywhere, but that red ball is back on his property. So he picks it up, brings it in his house, and goes back to bed. The next morning, he goes over to his neighbor's house to let them know that their kids are out in his yard in the middle of the night. But it turns out his neighbor is just some old man who lives alone, and there aren't any kids anywhere in the area. That night, he wakes up again to the sound of kids on his property, and when he looks outside, there's no kids, but that red ball is back on his property. Panicked, he runs downstairs to make sure the one he brought in is still inside, and it's gone. He checked every window and door, and everything was still locked. It didn't make any sense. He decides to look out the window one more time, and off in the distance is some weird, stiff figure watching him. This is why you should always change your locks. In 2017, a college girl woke up from a nightmare drenched in sweat and decided to rinse off before going back to sleep. She propped her phone on a shelf, turned on some music, and then hopped in the shower. A few minutes later, she reaches for her phone to change the song, but stops suddenly. Reflected on her phone's screen was a person standing in the middle of her bathroom facing the shower. She somehow kept her composure, turned the water to scalding hot, and then ripped open the curtain and sprayed the intruder in the face. As they howled in pain, she ran past them to her kitchen to get her butcher's knife. In a panic, she can't find her knife, so she just runs out of the apartment and calls the police. The police go in and come out with a crazy-looking woman in handcuffs. One of the officers comes over to the girl and says she used to live here and she had copies of your keys. Then he pauses and looks down and brings up a clear evidence bag that contained her butcher's knife, and he says, "Looks like she wanted her apartment back." Be careful what you put in your body. In 2014, a couple returned to their home to find it trashed in baffling ways. There was lotion all over the door handles, all of their shoes had had their soles ripped off of them, and someone had dumped an entire can of paint all over the toilet. Despite the obvious break-in, the police come and can't find any evidence of theft, so they leave thinking the couple's not in danger anymore. That night, the couple hears scratching underneath their bed and what sounds like a crying animal. Not wanting to find out what it was, they leave and call the cops, who come right back and start investigating the house, and they make a startling discovery in their bedroom. Wedged underneath the couple's bed was this 90-pound tiny little woman carrying a huge butcher's knife and a hypodermic needle. As they're taking this crazy lady away in handcuffs, one of the officers comes over to the couple and is like, so she was high on meth, and for at least 2 hours, she had been burrowing a hole in the underside of your mattress with that knife to get to you. This story has the best ending ever. In 2003, a 9-year-old was home alone playing video games when he thinks he hears his cat meowing on the back patio, so he goes downstairs to let him in. He sees a deranged-looking man standing on his back patio howling at the sky, who then quickly looks at the boy. He grabs a fistful of cigarette butts from the ashtray, stuffs them in his mouth before he starts howling at the sky some more. After the police take the man away, they come back to talk to the boy and his family. Turns out the man had severe autism and lived in that boy's house up until his mother passed away, at which time he was transitioned to a mental institution. He broke out of that mental institution to go looking for his mom, which is how he came back to the boy's house. 15 years later, that same boy is sitting on his same back patio when he starts to hear that same meowing sound, and he looks up and it's the same autistic man walking towards his house. Knowing the man's story, he invites him into his house. The man's face lights up, he runs inside and starts crying. He was finally home. The men become friends, and every week Tom goes home to visit. This is why you should always lock your doors. A junior in high school was home alone working on a paper while his parents were out to dinner. All night he sits with his back to his door, sitting at his desk with his noise-canceling headphones on. Around 11 o'clock, he takes his headphones off at the same time his parents are returning to the house, and he hears his mom from downstairs yell, "Hey Adrian, what happened?" Confused, he runs downstairs and sees right away what she's looking at: muddy footprints all over the rug. He tells her, "I didn't leave my desk." And then they realize someone must have broken in. They look at the footprints and there's none leaving the house. They're worried someone's still in the house, so they run into the garage, terrified, call the police. Police arrive and they don't find anyone in the house, but they do make a chilling discovery upstairs. The police bring them to the kid's bedroom door, which had been left open all night, and they point to the message written on it in Sharpie. This is the actual transcript of what was written on his door, which means for nearly 2 hours, someone stood in this kid's doorway watching him. Believe it or not, this is a well-documented, true story. In 1947, an American ship picked up a horrifying distress signal coming from an unidentified vessel. The first transmission was all officers, including the captain, are dead. The next transmission was the whole crew is dead. The last transmission was I die, and then silence. The Americans trace the signal back to a ship that's drifting off in the middle of the Indian Ocean. They quickly assemble a rescue team who boards the ship. They find the entire crew has perished in the exact same position. They are on their backs with their hands up as if fighting with some unseen force, and they look like this. There was no physical damage to the bodies or to the ship itself. However, even though it was 100 degrees outside, it was 40 degrees on the ship, and the bodies were rapidly decomposing. As soon as they tie up the ship to tow it in, it explodes, and then it sinks. To this day, no one knows what happened inside of that ship. Some say it was a chemical leak, others aren't so sure. This is why you should never stay in sketchy motels. In 2005, a young woman on a solo road trip across the country decided to stop for the night. The first place she sees is the Mountaintop Motel. It looked pretty cheap, but she was tired, so she said good enough. The check-in guy eyed her up and down very uncomfortably and then asked her if she was traveling alone. She ignores the question, pays for her room, and then walks away with the key. When she gets inside her room and sees there are literally cockroaches in her bed, she says nope and decides to sleep in her car in the parking lot. Around 3 a.m., she wakes up to see the check-in guy using his own keys to get into the motel room she was supposed to be in. A few minutes later, he storms out and slams the door and starts walking towards her car. Terrified, she hides under her blanket as the man tries to open her car doors but can't and walks away. She speeds off and calls her friend and asks her to look up the address of Mountaintop Motel so she can give it to police. Her friend's quiet for a second and then just says, "The Mountaintop Motel closed a week ago." This is why you should always look under the toilet seat before you sit down. In 2003, over a 5-day period in London, 3 women showed up to hospitals with the same mysterious symptoms. They say they woke up with these horrible bite marks on the backs of their legs, and then while they're at the hospital, they become paralyzed and die. Despite their similar symptoms, the women had nothing in common except that they had recently been to the same pub. Authorities immediately shut it down and do a thorough search inside of the pub, but can't find anything deadly, until one of the detectives goes to use the pub's bathroom. As he's about to sit down, he thinks he sees something moving in the toilet, so he gives it a little kick. Hiding in the toilet was one of the world's largest and most poisonous spiders, the Brazilian wandering spider, and now they needed to catch it. If someone offers you this, walk away. In 2016, a man was staying at his friend's cabin in the woods when he decided to go for an evening stroll. A little ways down the trail, he hears someone call out from behind his neighbor's house. He looks up and he sees this skinny guy pop out from behind the building who starts waving frantically at him to come over. Worried this guy could be in trouble, the man takes off running to assist, but when he gets close enough, the neighbor just offers him a fistful of Slim Jims and starts talking about how much he hates his wife. Sensing there was something wrong with this guy, he says no thank you to the Slim Jims and walks away. The next day, the man calls his friend who owned the cabin to ask him what the deal was with his weirdo neighbor. There was silence on the phone, and then his friend just says, "I don't have any neighbors." The police are called, and it turns out his neighbor was really some lunatic who had recently killed his wife and had been hiding out in the abandoned cabin next door. This is why you should always be scared of clowns. In 2004, a babysitter had just sat down to watch TV before the parents got back when she noticed something. In the corner of the room was a large clown statue that, no matter how she positioned herself, seemed like it was staring right at her. As she's looking at it, the father calls to check in on the kids. She tells him everything is fine, and right before they're about to hang up, she says, "Why do you have a huge clown statue in your TV room?" There was silence on the phone, and then the father just says, "We don't own a clown statue." She immediately drops the phone, runs upstairs, gets the kids, runs outside, calls the cops. Cops go in and come out with this guy. As the police are taking the clown away, one of the officers comes over to the girl and with a very grim look on his face just says, "We found him underneath one of the kids' beds. He was holding a sharpened screwdriver." You're about to hear one of the most disturbing true stories on the internet. In 1921, a German farmer woke up to find a deep set of footprints leading from the forest right up to his back door. Whoever had come to his house had not left yet. After making sure it wasn't just his family, he searched everywhere on his property and his house everywhere, and he could not determine who made the prints or where they went. A few weeks later, his maid abruptly quit, saying that every time she's alone in the house, she hears demonic voices in the attic. Shortly thereafter, he and his family start to hear the voices too. When no one's heard from them in a couple days, the neighbors go over to check and they find them in the barn. One by one, each of the family members made their way down to the barn where they were systematically murdered and stacked in the corner. To this day, no one knows who or what is responsible for this crime. This girl literally lived a nightmare. A 17-year-old girl was watching TV late at night when her motion detector lights in her driveway suddenly went on. She assumed it was just an animal, so she got up, drew the blinds, and went back to watching TV. Then a little bit later, it happened again. Before she could even react, she looks over and clearly makes out a silhouette of a person right behind the blinds who starts banging aggressively on the window. The girl stands up and goes, "I'm gonna call the cops!" And the figure stops for just a second, sprints to the side door and starts pounding even louder on that, screaming incoherently. The girl runs to the bathroom, barricades herself inside while she waits for the police, and then her worst nightmares come true. She hears glass shatter in the other room. After a few minutes of silence, she opens her door just a crack to get a peek outside, and standing in her living room next to a broken window is some crazy old woman who looks over at her and starts sprinting toward her. The lady comes smashing into the door and starts wailing on it until the police arrive and take her away. She was a lunatic who had escaped her facility. Yes, the picture at the end is real. In 1876, a woman from a very prominent family in Paris goes missing. After years go by and no one has a clue what happened to this woman, friends and family ultimately mourn her death and move on. 25 years later, and this anonymous letter shows up on the Attorney General's desk, claiming that the missing woman's family had a secret. Intrigued by the letter, the police go to the family's home, show it to them, and ask to search the property, to which they say, go for it. They search, they don't find anything, but on the way out, they notice something very peculiar. At the end of some stairs was a door that was padlocked shut. When the family refused to open it, the police break it down and make a horrifying discovery. Cowering on a rotten straw mattress in a pitch-black room was the missing woman, now 50 years old and extremely malnourished. Her mother had imprisoned her there after they had fought over her boyfriend, and she had not seen sunlight or another human being in 25 years. This is why you should always take your lockdown drills seriously. In 2017, two 16-year-olds were in their school bathroom when the lights suddenly went out and their school went into lockdown. Feeling rebellious, they decide, you know what, let's go explore the school a little bit first, and then we'll go follow procedure. They step out of the bathroom and look down the hall towards their classroom, and they see this large figure standing in front of their classrooms. It's definitely not a student, it's not a teacher. He's got ragged clothes on, and he starts walking towards them. They dart right back into the bathroom to the corner stall where they hide, praying that that man didn't see them. The man bursts in and starts yanking open all the stalls. Not wanting to see what happens when he gets to their stall, they get on the ground and start crawling to the side of the room, where they finally get up and make a run for the door. They look back and he's holding a gun. The boys manage to get away safely and no one's hurt, but the police never capture the ragged man. This is why you should be very careful who you talk to online. A 16-year-old girl was home with her mom when she got a disturbing text message from a boy she had recently met on Snapchat. He told her he was right outside of her house, but when she went to look, no one was there. Frightened, she decides to sleep in her mom's room that night, and right before she goes to bed, she gets another text from the boy that just says, "I'm in your house." She shows her mom, who immediately searches the whole house, checks every door, turns on every light. There's no one there. So even though they're creeped out, they go back to bed. The next morning, she gets up and she goes back to her bedroom and immediately feels like she's being watched. She checks in her closet, looks behind her door, there's no one there. Then she noticed that the shoe boxes she normally kept perfectly arranged next to her bed had been moved. So she crouches down to put them back in order, and then out of the corner of her eyes, she notices something. The boy who was texting her was under her bed. Moral of the story, don't sleep on the first floor. In 2014, a young woman woke up to strange noises coming from under her bed. When she finally worked up the courage to look, there was nothing there. The next morning when she got up, there were footprints leading right up to the sliding door that went right into her room. She instantly calls her dad, who comes over and traces the footsteps back to a house of a very troubled teen who admitted to spying on her. But he swore up and down he hadn't done that in weeks. They don't believe him, and they threaten to call the police if they ever see him on the property again. That night, the girl's on her phone in bed when she starts to hear the strange sounds again. This is why you should always watch what you say in public. In the late 1970s, a man began breaking into homes in order to assault the families inside of them. After dozens of attacks and no suspects in custody, the citizens were totally on edge, so the police decide to host this town hall meeting so they can discuss the situation out in public. During the meeting, a local man stands up and says, "I would totally kick that guy's ass if he came anywhere near my wife." Then, in a crazy, ironic turn of events, that angry man and his wife become the next victims. Following their assault, the attacker completely changes his behavior. He goes from kind of petty home invader to full-blown serial killer, targeting only married men and their wives. When decades later, police finally identify Joseph D'Angelo as the killer, as they're going through old photos from the case, they make a startling discovery about his motives. D'Angelo had attended that town hall meeting. Yes, this really did happen. In 2015, a man woke up to a strange post-it note sitting on his desk. On it was a to-do list that he didn't recognize in handwriting that didn't look like his. Since he was up late the night before doing some work, he assumed he must have written out the list when he was half asleep and kind of forgot about it, so he just crumples it up and throws it away. 2 weeks later, he wakes up to dozens of these post-it notes all over his wall, and they're all blank except for one that, in the same weird handwriting, says, "Our landlord isn't letting me talk to you." Now feeling totally freaked out that some crazy person is crawling around his apartment at night, he starts looking for signs of a break-in, but there aren't any. Instead of calling the police, he shares his experience on Reddit asking for help, and one user's comment literally saves his life. Turns out the man was writing the notes to himself and then forgetting, because his brain was slowly dying due to a carbon monoxide leak that was only discovered because a user suggested he install a detector. Everybody thinks this video is fake until they see what's in the vent. In 2018, a group of urban explorers decided to check out this abandoned factory. As soon as they go inside, they see this warning on the wall. They go upstairs anyways and immediately hear voices from the floor above them. Instead of running away like normal people, they go up to have a look. They trace the voices back to this vent, so they think, and they take their camera and they slide it in to have a look. When they review the footage, they can't believe what they found.